The radar scope flashed once, then went blank. Inside a hardened radar station deep in Belarus, a Soviet air defense operator rubbed his eyes. It was the middle of the night. Snow blanketed the airfield outside, muffling the sounds of duty. The screens hummed, the antennas turned. The long-range P-14 Tall King radar swept eastward, bathing the upper atmosphere in raw megawatts of electromagnetic energy. Nothing. Then it blinked again, a flicker on the edge of the screen. Altitude, 50,000 feet. Velocity, subsonic. Signature, almost non-existent. The operator stared. He adjusted the gain. He double-checked his azimuth. But the target was gone. Maybe interference, maybe atmospheric ducting, maybe a flock of birds? He logged it and said nothing. 5 hours later, Soviet command received a high-priority flash message from a missile complex in Kazakhstan. Primary alert. Airbase perimeter breached. Explosive detonation confirmed. No prior radar warning. No unidentified aircraft tracked. No warning, no tracks, no answers. The generals demanded an explanation. Was it sabotage? An internal detonation? A systems failure? But one colonel, thumbing through satellite logs and high-frequency radio chatter from U.S. operations in Diego Garcia, muttered just 5 words. It was the American Ghost. Not a cruise missile, not an F-111. This wasn't a plane that had dodged radar. It was one that had ignored it entirely. There had been whispers in the Pentagon, rumors in Soviet intelligence files. A black-winged specter, shaped like a manta ray, designed in total secrecy by engineers who had buried every clue of its existence. They called it the B-2 Spirit, a bomber not designed to fight radar, but to erase its relevance. And this night, under the cover of darkness and radio silence, it had done exactly what it was built for. It had slipped past every sensor the Soviets had. It had struck deep. And it had left nothing behind but silence. This wasn't a theoretical capability anymore. It was operational. And it had just rewritten the rules of war. From that moment forward, Soviet radar crews would no longer mock the B-2. They would fear it. Because the ghost was real. And it was already inside the wire. In the halls of the Soviet Ministry of Defense, beneath chandeliers and polished marble, confidence echoed louder than radar beams. It was the early 1980s, and the Soviet Union had built the most expansive integrated air defense network in human history. From the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea, overlapping radar fields scanned the skies 24 hours a day. P-18s, P-14s, spoon rests, flat faces, and towering P-35s formed a lattice of electromagnetic power. Combined with mobile tracking units, GCI posts, and a fleet of interceptors and surface-to-air missile batteries, it was a system designed to deny NATO the sky. And in that world, the very idea of an invisible bomber sounded like science fiction. In debriefings and war games, Soviet generals scoffed at the notion of American stealth aircraft. Invisible to radar? They laughed. Maybe to a drunk radar crew, not ours. They had reasons to be confident. Since the 1950s, the USSR had kept pace with, and often surpassed, Western radar innovations. Their long-range early warning systems could detect bombers over the horizon. Their Doppler radars were designed to eliminate noise from birds, terrain, and weather. And their SAM systems, from the SA-2 to the monstrous SA-5, could SWAT targets from the stratosphere. Every bomber the West had built, B-47, B-52, even the supersonic B-58 Hustler, was designed around trying to survive Soviet radar. None had ever proposed flying through it unnoticed. So when whispers of a next-generation U.S. stealth bomber began to trickle in through intelligence circles in the late 1970s, they were dismissed. The Pentagon had always been good at marketing. If the Americans were truly building a ghost plane, Soviet engineers reasoned, it would have to obey the same rules of physics. Radar could bend, scatter, refract, but it could never be truly defeated. Their working theory? Any so-called stealth plane might reduce its radar cross-section slightly, making detection more difficult. But against a fully engaged air defense network, it would still be tracked, still be intercepted, and still be destroyed. A B-2 bomber, they claimed, would be a luxury target, slow, unmaneuverable, and extremely expensive. If the Americans wanted to fly them, let them. The USSR would shoot them down and bankrupt the enemy at the same time. What they didn't realize was that their radar doctrine was already behind the curve. American engineers weren't just designing for radar reflection. They were reshaping the entire electromagnetic footprint of the aircraft, reducing heat signature, sound profile, visual shape, even minimizing its own emissions. This wasn't about hiding. It was about erasing. But in the war rooms of Moscow, denial held firm. The radar was king. And no aircraft, not even some triangular black ghost, could defy the king forever. The B-2 would prove them catastrophically wrong. Since the 1950s, the Soviet air defense strategy was built on one principle. If it flies, we will see it. And if we see it, we will kill it. The Warsaw Pact's surface-to-air missile network was legendary, with thousands of launchers, from short-range SA-6s to high-altitude SA-5 Gammon systems. It stretched across Eastern Europe like a wall of fire. Interceptor squadrons stood ready at dozens of bases, fueled, armed, and waiting for a radar blip. But all of it depended on one crucial assumption: detection. From the beginning, Soviet doctrine revolved around the radar barrier. Every attacking aircraft would have to cross at least one radar field. Once spotted, it would trigger the IADS, Integrated Air Defense System, linking missiles, guns, and fighters in a brutal cascade of responses. No jet could cross that line and survive alone. Not even high-speed American aircraft like the SR-71 dared penetrate deep without electronic warfare support or a full combat package. The B-52s, stalwarts of American air power, were built to fly high and fast. But they still showed up on radar like flying barns. So when the Pentagon began testing new designs that claimed to be invisible to radar, Soviet planners rolled their eyes. Their doctrine had an answer for everything. Low-flying aircraft? Deploy low-frequency radars and terrain-following SAMs. Supersonic threats? Use Doppler filters to isolate fast movers. Jamming? Flood the airwaves with passive and active countermeasures. Decoys? Cross-reference with thermal imaging and multi-band sensors. As far as Moscow was concerned, stealth was an illusion. Even if American engineers managed to reduce radar reflection, Soviet commanders believed in layered coverage. If the early warning radar missed it, the mid-range radar would catch it. If not there, then fire control radars would see it during the final approach. Multiple angles, multiple frequencies, multiple chances. It wasn't just strategy, it was ideology. The USSR had spent decades investing in radar supremacy. It was cheaper than air superiority, more scalable. Ground-based units could be deployed anywhere. And it fit the Soviet mindset: static, overwhelming, and unforgiving. Air power in the Soviet Union was never about individual brilliance. It was about systems, grids, networked redundancy. And so they dismissed any bomber that relied on invisibility as a gimmick. Stealth, they believed, was fragile. One drop of rain, one engine plume, one slip in alignment, and the radar would catch it. Their fatal mistake was assuming that American stealth was just a defensive trick. But it wasn't. The B-2 was being designed not just to avoid radar, but to exploit its rigidity. It didn't need to outrun missiles. It didn't need to dogfight. All it needed was to not appear. And the Soviet radar web, so proud, so vast, was about to be shown for what it truly was: a net woven for the wrong kind of war. At first, it was dismissed as a testing anomaly, then as a calibration failure, then as something that simply couldn't have happened. In the spring of 1981, over a classified test range near Groom Lake, Nevada, a small team of radar engineers gathered in a control bunker. Their task: track a prototype aircraft during a high-altitude penetration run across a full-spectrum radar field. The radar array had been specifically designed for this moment. Multiple bands, overlapping ranges, simulated Soviet search patterns. They were told this would be the test of America's newest stealth platform. What they didn't expect was to see nothing at all. At 0400 hours, the B-2 prototype, codenamed Senior Ice, lifted off under total radio silence. Painted matte black, its profile shaped like a flying boomerang, the IA aircraft disappeared against the night sky. The radars began scanning. High frequency, low frequency, passive arrays, Doppler traps, all of them searching for one thing: return signal. But the screens remained blank. Some operators began to worry the prototype had deviated course or crashed. But telemetry confirmed. The aircraft was right on path. In fact, it was directly overhead. And yet, no radar detected it. Not just reduced signal, not just minor interference, nothing. Engineers scrambled. Maybe the radar was malfunctioning? They rerouted to auxiliary receivers. Still blank. They widened the scan angle. Still blank. They shifted frequencies. Still blank. It wasn't just flying under the radar. It was flying through it. Post-mission analysis would confirm that the aircraft's radar cross-section, RCS, was smaller than a bird. One engineer compared it to the signature of a steel marble, and even that was only detectable at close range. The impossible had happened. Not only had the aircraft penetrated a dense radar net without detection, it had done so under conditions meant to simulate the worst-case scenario. This wasn't a stealth fighter darting through canyons at low altitude. This was a full-sized strategic bomber flying right through the teeth of a modern air defense net, and emerging invisible. What had once been science fiction was now an operational reality. The flying wing design, inherited from the YB-49 lineage and radically refined, had proven its worth. Its edges were angled to scatter radar waves. Its surface was coated with radar-absorbent materials. Its engines were buried deep inside the body, masking heat and exhaust. Even its antennas were recessed and shaped to reduce emissions. More importantly, it wasn't just built to avoid radar, it was built to confuse it. One technician reviewing the logs said, "We didn't see a ghost, we saw nothing." For the first time in history, a bomber had not just penetrated a radar net, it had rendered that net irrelevant. Back in Washington, a single word echoed across Pentagon briefings: operationalize. The impossible had just become America's newest weapon, and thousands of miles away, in Soviet radar bunkers still confident in their early warning grids, a blind spot had just been born. One they couldn't detect, one they couldn't predict, and one that very soon they would learn to fear. The first Soviet reports of an invisible bomber were met with outright dismissal. Not skepticism. Mockery. By the mid-1980s, Soviet intelligence had intercepted enough rumors from Western defense circles to piece together that the Americans were testing something radically new: a long-range bomber capable of penetrating dense radar networks undetected. The files trickled in through compromised embassies, open-source defense journals, and informants buried in U.S. defense contracting firms. They pointed to a black project, massively expensive, shrouded in secrecy, and codenamed Advanced Technology Bomber. But when these reports reached the desks of Soviet Air Defense Command, the response was predictable. Stealth? A fantasy. Radar sees everything. In briefings, Soviet generals were shown diagrams of the supposed design: swept wings, no tail, no vertical surfaces. Some speculated it was just a psychological operation, America spending billions to bluff its way into strategic superiority. Soviet radar doctrine stood on decades of engineering triumph. Their defense networks had tracked everything from U-2s to SR-71s. Even the fastest, highest-flying aircraft had to obey the laws of physics, and physics said radar couldn't be beaten. Maybe bent, maybe delayed, but not nullified. And so Moscow clung to that belief. They ran simulations, sent up Tu-16 Badger aircraft with radar-absorbing coatings, fielded new variants of mobile low-frequency radar, and in each case, the results were the same. Stealth was marginal. At best, it delayed detection. At worst, it was meaningless under multi-band radar coverage. One internal analysis concluded, "The Americans can reduce signature, but they cannot eliminate it. Our net will catch them, sooner or later." Their confidence wasn't entirely unjustified. Radar isn't one system, it's many, operating at different wavelengths, using different techniques. Even if one radar missed, another might track. Even if the cross-section was small, signal processors could amplify returns. The Soviet I-8s was a multi-layered beast. No single aircraft could slip past it all. Or so they thought. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't yet imagine, was that the B-2 Spirit wasn't simply a plane with stealth coating. It was a system, meticulously engineered from every angle to absorb, deflect, mask, and avoid every known detection method. Its wing design eliminated all radar reflective surfaces. Its engines were cooled and hidden, neutering infrared signatures. Its onboard electronics operated on emission control protocols, rendering it radio silent. Even its flight paths were calculated to avoid radar lobes, side lobe leakage, and terrain-induced reflections. Moscow didn't believe it, because to believe it would mean acknowledging a devastating truth. The Americans had built something the Soviet Union could not defend against, and that truth, if spoken aloud, would unravel decades of air defense strategy. So they dismissed it, laughed at it, filed it away under improbable Western propaganda. Meanwhile, at Whiteman Air Force Base, the real B-2s were taking shape, assembled in silence, tested at night, and preparing for a mission that Moscow still believed was impossible. They were ghosts, and the Soviets were still staring at radars that no longer mattered. For every stealth claim the Americans made, the Soviets had a radar answer, and that answer always began with one premise: you can't fool every frequency. By the late 1980s, Soviet radar designers had cataloged every Western trick: radar-absorbent coatings, angled panels, recessed intakes. They knew these designs worked best against high-frequency radars, like X-band fire control radars used on missiles and fighters. But Soviet doctrine leaned heavily into multi-frequency coverage. The belief was simple: if high-band radar can be fooled, low-band radar will catch you. So they invested in VHF and UHF search radars, systems like the P-18 Spoon Rest, which operated on longer wavelengths that ignored stealth shaping. The theory was that these radars couldn't offer pinpoint targeting, but they could alert the network to the presence of a threat, prompting missile batteries and interceptors to begin their hunt. The logic was sound. On paper. Soviet engineers presented reams of calculations showing that a stealth aircraft designed to defeat X-band radar would be far less effective against VHF. They ran simulations, they conducted mock interceptions, they produced neat graphics showing radar beams bouncing off F-117-like shapes and catching glimpses of them. But there were three problems. Three flaws in the Soviet radar theory they refused to acknowledge. First, signal resolution. Yes, low-frequency radar could see stealth shapes, but not with clarity. Their resolution was so poor that a B-2 might appear as a random noise spike, indistinguishable from ground clutter or weather. By the time the system verified the target, the bomber would already be gone. Second, integration delay. The Soviet IADS wasn't seamless. It relied on command handoffs between systems. VHF radars would detect, then pass to mid-frequency search radars, then to fire control radars. Each handoff took seconds, too slow against a silent bomber moving deep and fast. Third, tactical blindness. Stealth wasn't just a shape, it was a doctrine. The B-2 didn't fly into known radar arcs. It mapped them in advance, flew in at precise altitudes and angles, using terrain to mask itself even further. Radar nets weren't impenetrable walls. They were fields of probability, and the B-2 was built to glide right between the cracks. Still, Soviet commanders clung to their radar supremacy. They doubled down on radar field density, pushed for more mobile units, upgraded radar processors, and they believed the math would hold. But the math never fought in the dark. The math never dealt with a bomber that could change heading mid-flight to dodge a radar lobe. The math never accounted for an aircraft that could turn invisible at will. In one internal memo, a Soviet colonel questioned the dogma. "We keep building thicker nets. But what if the Americans aren't trying to break through? What if they're slipping between the threads?" The question went unanswered. The doctrine was firm. Radar was king. But doctrine doesn't win wars. And somewhere over the North Atlantic, a black-winged ghost was already rehearsing routes that Moscow's radar lords insisted were impossible. The net was tight. But the ghost didn't need to break it. It only needed to pass through unseen. If stealth couldn't be beaten technologically, then perhaps it could be beaten economically. That was the second theory. And on its surface, it looked like a winning argument. To Soviet planners reviewing U.S. defense budgets in the 1980s, the B-2 Spirit program seemed like a catastrophic indulgence. With a per-unit cost exceeding $2 billion and a projected fleet of just 132 aircraft, the stealth bomber looked like the costliest aircraft ever conceived. Critics in the West echoed similar doubts. Soviet analysts believed the math would break the machine. Let them build the B-2, they reasoned. But it would be so few in number and so expensive to operate that it could never pose a real strategic threat. And when war came, these gold-plated ghosts would be too rare to matter. They underestimated how far the U.S. was willing to go. In classified briefings to the Politburo, Soviet intelligence officials highlighted budget reports from the Pentagon. Each B-2 was more expensive than 10 MiG-29s, and its maintenance required climate-controlled hangars and exotic materials. One report even mocked the aircraft's radar-absorbing coating, noting it required constant reapplication and expensive upkeep. The conclusion was simple. The Americans have built a bomber they cannot afford to lose. The Soviet Union had always favored mass over elegance. It was the principle behind the T-72 tank, the MiG-21, and the SA-2 missile system. Simple, rugged, built in the thousands. Victory through scale. They assumed the West played by the same rules. But the B-2 was never designed to be lost. It was designed to win before detection was even possible. What Soviet planners failed to understand was that stealth inverted the economics of war. It wasn't about how many aircraft you needed to launch. It was about how many could get through. Where conventional bombers might require dozens of escort fighters, jammers, and decoys, the B-2 needed none. It could fly alone, at night, through the strongest air defenses in the world, and strike with pinpoint precision. One B-2 could do the job of an entire strike package, and that made it priceless. The irony? The Soviets' own doctrine had inflated the B-2's value. By building such an enormous and layered air defense network, the USSR had made conventional bombing cost-prohibitive for NATO. That very challenge is what pushed the US to invent stealth in the first place. And now, the solution was here. The US didn't need to match the Warsaw Pact plane for plane, missile for missile. It only needed one jet that could ignore the entire system. So while Soviet generals laughed at the cost, US war planners were smiling at the results. The B-2 wasn't fragile, it was revolutionary. And it didn't matter how few were built. Because one could end a war on its own. The second theory had failed. Stealth wasn't too expensive to field, it was too effective not to. The Soviet Union didn't lose to stealth because it had no warning. It lost because it ignored the warnings it had. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, Soviet intelligence services, including the GRU and KGB, collected fragmentary but revealing clues about U.S. advances in stealth technology. There were intercepted memos from Lockheed's Skunk Works, procurement anomalies in radar-absorbent materials, unusual electromagnetic testing ranges cropping up in Nevada, satellite images of strange, tailless aircraft. But the reports were scattered. The assessments, cautious, and worst of all, the conclusions drawn were fatally dismissive. A 1981 GRU briefing to the Central Committee stated, "The Americans appear to be experimenting with radar suppression coatings and exotic fuselage designs. These systems are highly experimental and economically inefficient. Full deployment is unlikely." The file was stamped, "Low threat priority." What Soviet analysts failed to understand, or refused to believe, was that the U.S. wasn't just conducting experiments. It was building a new class of warfare. In parallel, even the early combat deployment of the F-117 Nighthawk in the mid-1980s, another stealth platform, was overlooked. When the Nighthawk struck targets in Panama and later in Iraq, Soviet observers chalked it up to overwhelming American air superiority, not the aircraft's ability to operate undetected. The misjudgment ran deeper than technology. It was a systemic flaw in Soviet intelligence analysis, an institutional habit of underestimating innovation that didn't match their own logic. In their world, a strategic bomber had to be massive, fast, and heavily armored. If it didn't scream power, it wasn't worth fearing. They collected data on radar-absorbent polymers, but their material scientists deemed it too maintenance-intensive. They monitored funding for strange airframes, but dismissed them as CIA ghost projects. Even as the B-2 entered final testing, Soviet intelligence still categorized the bomber as a theoretical deterrent, not an operational threat. By the time reconnaissance satellites photographed the first operational B-2s rolling out at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, it was 1988. And even then, the reaction was muted. One internal KGB analyst wrote, "It is visually impressive, but without escort or electronic warfare support, it cannot operate inside contested airspace." They still believed radar was king. What they didn't realize was that the B-2 didn't need any of those things. The ghost was real, it was flying. And the Soviet Union's entire intelligence apparatus, spanning continents and agencies, had failed to see it coming. When the B-2's first missions began in secret war games and then quietly expanded to international readiness, it was already too late for Moscow to counter it. The ultimate irony? The B-2 wasn't just invisible to radar. It had been invisible to intelligence the whole time. By the time they recognized it as a real threat, the Soviet air defense doctrine was already obsolete, and there would be no second chance to adapt. The B-2 Spirit was not just an aircraft. It was the final form of a doctrine. To the outside world, it appeared as a winged black triangle, elegant and alien, an oddity in the skies. But within the Pentagon and at Air Force headquarters, it was viewed as something far more powerful, a system-level disruptor, built not to defeat one part of enemy defense, but to render the entire Soviet air defense structure irrelevant. It started with shape. Unlike conventional aircraft, the B-2 was a flying wing, a design with no vertical stabilizers, no tail, no fuselage projections. Nothing for radar waves to reflect off predictably. Its body was mathematically contoured to scatter incoming radar energy away from the source, not back to it. Every edge, every curve, every angle had one job: disappear. Then came its materials. The entire aircraft was coated in radar-absorbent material, RAM, a skin designed to absorb and dissipate radar waves as heat. But this wasn't paint. It was a layered composite. Vulnerable parts like engine inlets were deeply buried inside the wing, masked by S-shaped ducts that prevented radar waves from bouncing down into turbine blades. Even the cockpit canopy was electroconductive, shielding its interior from radar exposure. Its radar cross-section, or RCS, was staggering. Smaller than a bird. Measured in square meters, it was estimated to be 0.1 square meters or less compared to the B-52's 100-plus square meters. In simulated Soviet detection ranges, the B-2 appeared smaller than a metal ball. But stealth was only the surface. Underneath, the B-2 carried one of the most sophisticated mission systems of the Cold War. The A and APQ-181 radar, which could map terrain, track moving targets, and guide weapons, all while remaining nearly undetectable. A digital fly-by-wire system that made the unstable flying wing manageable. Precision-guided munitions, GBU-31 JDAMs, nuclear gravity bombs, and future hypersonic options. Onboard mission planning systems that could recalculate routes in real time to avoid radar lobes, enemy patrols, and environmental interference. It didn't need support aircraft. It didn't need jamming pods. It didn't need a squadron of decoys. It flew alone. And most terrifying of all, it operated under emission control, MCON, a flight mode in which the B-2 remained electronically silent. No pings, no broadcasts, no chatter. It was a black hole in the electromagnetic spectrum. From a tactical perspective, it was a sniper rifle in a battlefield of machine guns. But what made the B-2 unstoppable was how it changed the rules. Every Soviet system, radar, SAM, interceptor, was designed to detect, track, and react. The B-2 made the first step, detection, functionally impossible. That broke the chain. If the radar couldn't see it, the SAM never launched. If the SAM didn't launch, the MiG never scrambled. If the MiG never scrambled, the target never defended. The entire Soviet strategy, built on interception and layered engagement, collapsed into silence. In this way, the B-2 did something no bomber had ever done before. It invalidated an entire class of enemy technology. And this was no accident. The U.S. hadn't just built a stealth bomber, it had built an ecosystem to support it. Decades of satellite intelligence to plan undetectable routes. Real-time data links and AWACS coordination for post-mission command. Stealthy weapon loadouts that allowed for total mission execution without support. And most crucially, airspace dominance without needing a single fighter escort. Soviet generals had once mocked the B-2 as a hangar queen, too costly and fragile to matter. Now they stared at simulations that showed it could strike the Kremlin itself and vanish before the first alarm. In wargames across NATO, it routinely killed targets protected by triple-layered SAM defenses. In stealth-only exercises, it completed 90% of its missions without detection. Even post-Cold War air defense systems have failed to track it effectively in open skies. The B-2 didn't win air superiority. It made the entire air superiority fight unnecessary. It was no longer a question of fighting through radar. It was a question of flying around it, before it even woke up. Invisible, precise, untouchable. That was the true American system, and it was now airborne. It wasn't a war, it wasn't even an open conflict. But for the Soviet Union's air defense establishment, It was a defeat so absolute, so silent, that it echoed louder than bombs. The B-2 Spirit never needed a dramatic debut over Moscow skies. It didn't have to shoot down a MiG or outrun a SAM to prove itself. Instead, its greatest victory came in a simulated war game, one so damning that it was kept classified for years. The scenario was simple: penetrate Soviet airspace, strike a high-value target in the Urals, and exit without detection. A mock-up of the Soviet integrated air defense system was recreated in Nevada: overlapping radar fields, early warning posts, layered SAM batteries. Soviet-trained operators and advisors even helped simulate realistic response patterns. On the other side, a single B-2 bomber. No escort, no jamming, no decoys. Just the ghost. The mission began at night. The B-2 lifted off, ran silent, and entered the engagement zone from an unexpected vector, below a radar coverage arc mapped by satellite and recon. It adjusted altitude 3 times en route, using mountainous terrain and radar shadow zones to avoid known scan paths. The result? The entire Soviet-style radar net failed to register its presence. Not once. Not even a whisper. Mid-range detection radar didn't see it. SAM batteries received no lock-on tone. Intercept fighters were never scrambled. The B-2 reached the target, an enemy command bunker, and released simulated bombs with pinpoint accuracy. They struck within 3 meters of the intended point. The bomber exited the airspace undetected. Not hard to track. Not jammed. Invisible. When the data was compiled, the engineers and intelligence analysts at the simulation center fell into stunned silence. They ran the mission again. Then a third time. Each time, the B-2 slipped past every Soviet defense with impunity. This wasn't just a tactical breakthrough, it was a strategic collapse. Everything the USSR had spent decades building, the massive radar grid, the thousands of SAM batteries, the heavily coordinated IADS, had been bypassed by one jet. And when these results were fed into actual Soviet radar models, the news only worsened. If a B-2 launched from Diego Garcia, it could reach critical Soviet infrastructure deep inside the Urals before Moscow even registered a radar anomaly. If war broke out, the first clue might be a detonation, not a warning. And if the target was nuclear command and control, there would be no retaliation. Back in the real world, the Soviets were still training radar crews to hunt B-52s, still calibrating their missile batteries to chase high-speed, high-signature threats, still believing in visibility. They never trained for ghosts. To the West, this simulation confirmed what they had already suspected. The B-2 had redefined what it meant to control the skies. But to the Soviets, had they ever seen the full truth, it would have been a national humiliation. A bomber that made their entire air defense irrelevant. A jet they couldn't track. A system they couldn't kill. And the worst part? It had never even needed to try. It had won by simply not being there. For decades, the Soviet Union believed in invincibility through mass, coverage, and deterrence. Its strategic doctrine didn't just rely on hardware. It depended on the belief that no American weapon could evade its layered defenses. But the B-2 didn't evade them. It ignored them. When the U.S. unveiled the B-2 Spirit publicly in 1988, the images that filtered through Soviet intelligence channels were met with disbelief. Not because the aircraft looked futuristic, but because its very existence shattered the ideological foundation of Soviet air defense. This wasn't just a tactical platform, it was a strategic endgame. Everything the USSR had built to secure its skies, overlapping radar nets, thousands of SAMs, interceptors guided by ground control, was obsolete in a single generation of American stealth. Their vast system of deterrence had depended on the certainty of mutual detection. The moment that equation was broken, when one side could strike without warning or retaliation, the entire Cold War balance shifted. And that's exactly what the B-2 represented. In internal memos, Soviet defense analysts began whispering dangerous phrases. "We are blind to modern American air power. No radar doctrine can compensate for this threat. If they strike first, we will not respond in time." This wasn't just military panic. It was ideological collapse. For over 40 years, the Soviet military-industrial complex had poured trillions of rubles into radar, missiles, and interception theory. Their propaganda had assured the people that no American jet could ever reach the motherland unpunished. But with the B-2, the punishment could arrive before they even heard the engines. Soviet air defense was no longer just outdated. It was meaningless in the face of a stealth system it couldn't detect, couldn't engage, and couldn't prevent. The Cold War had always been about numbers: nuclear stockpiles, warhead counts, divisions of tanks. But now, a single aircraft, flying silently, precisely, could do what entire bomber fleets couldn't: end the war before it began. When the Berlin Wall fell, and the Soviet Union collapsed 2 years later, few outside the intelligence community understood the full scope of how B-2 development had tilted the strategic chessboard. But inside the Kremlin, the realization had already taken root. They hadn't just lost a race in stealth. They had lost the skies, and worse, they had done so without ever seeing the enemy. Today, the B-2 Spirit flies in limited numbers. Only 21 were ever built. But each one remains a symbol, not just of stealth, but of what the Cold War truly became in its final decade. Not a clash of armies, not a nuclear exchange, but a technological race where visibility itself became a vulnerability. You can visit one now, on static display. It looks oddly peaceful, sleek, black, quiet. It doesn't roar, it doesn't intimidate, it just waits. Yet behind that stillness lies a ghost, a machine so perfect in its mission it was never once fired upon in combat by enemy radar, because no radar ever saw it. It flew over Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, each time alone, each time unchallenged. It dropped bombs with surgical precision, and it always came home. The Soviets had mocked it, dismissed stealth as a fantasy, believed in numbers, in power, in radar as the great equalizer. But the B-2 rewrote that faith, not by confrontation, but by elimination. It didn't defeat air defense. It made air defense irrelevant. In doing so, it didn't just end an arms race. It redefined the nature of air power forever. Because sometimes, the most powerful weapon in history is the one that doesn't show up on radar. The B-2 Spirit wasn't just a ghost in Soviet skies, it was a prophecy, a warning, that the next war wouldn't be seen. It would already be over.